American politics, few ideas stir as much conflict and turmoil as the phrase separation of church and state. Where did this phrase originate? And was the original intent to prohibit religious expression in the political arena? Or does the phrase separation of church and state now mean something it was never intended? Discover the forgotten and astonishing story of our nation's foundation in the American Heritage series. For centuries, Americans were taught a truthful view of history that recognized the godly heroes and moral foundation our nation was founded upon. But in recent years, a new version of history has assaulted the moral and spiritual fiber of our nation, leaving the truth of our past eliminated and forgotten until today. Join historian David Barton and experience the untold story of our nation's history in the American Heritage series. In modern politics, the term separation of church and state is most commonly used to ban acts of faith in the public arena. But a closer look into history reveals the intentions of this phrase to be just the opposite. How then has our history been redefined and rewritten? Discover our nation's godly history in the American Heritage series. America, this is your heritage.
Separation of church and state has become one of the best-known phrases in American history, and it's a phrase that's been completely turned on its head from what its original intent was. When you look at separation of church and state, that was not a phrase that came from secularists trying to keep Christians out of the public arena. It was a phrase that came out of the Reformation trying to keep the government out of the church.
Now, you said some pretty interesting thing that I've never heard before, that the Reformation, okay, that period of time was really based upon that issue. We always thought that Protestantism was coming away from Catholicism, and that created the Protestant church, but you're saying that really the Reformation was really to get the affairs of the state out of the affairs of the church.
Exactly. The Reformation was not a Catholic Protestant thing at all, because the Reformation was saying, hey, wait a minute, we're doing these practices, here's what the Bible teaches, let's go back to what the Bible teaches.
Got it.
Now, eventually, after 2 centuries of that, the Protestant church was birthed, but that was never the design, that was never the intent.
Wow.
These guys were loyal Catholic priests who were just saying, we need to go back to the Bible. Now, you had Henry VIII who birthed the Protestant or the Anglican church because he wanted to be in charge of something, so he wanted his own church to be in charge of, so he birthed it. And then you had Anglicans saying, wait a minute, we're not doing this right, here's what the Bible teaches. And it's the Bible that teaches separation of church and state, but it's an institutional separation, not an influential separation.
Got it.
You see, the first time you find the phrase is in England in the 1500s with a theologian, Richard Hooker, and he's the one who first used the phrase separation of church and state. Then as you come into American history, you find the first use of the phrase separation of church and state is by the minister, Christian minister, Roger Williams. It's the same thing. He's trying to get the government to leave the church alone.
We so often hear the Constitution's religion clauses in the First Amendment coupled with the phrase separation of church and state. Yet concerning religion, the First Amendment only states, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Clearly, neither the word separation, nor church, nor state is found in any part of the First Amendment. In fact, that phrase appears in no governmental founding document. Of course, most today recognize the phrase separation of church and state, but few know its source. Yet it is important to understand the origins of that phrase and how it subsequently became somehow attached to the First Amendment. The debates surrounding the framing of the First Amendment ran from June the 7th through September the 25th of 1789, and the records of those debates make unequivocally clear that the First Amendment's purpose was to limit the federal government in 2 specific areas. First, the federal government was prohibited from establishing a national denomination, whether Catholic, Anglican, or any other. This was the very problem that America had faced when she was part of Great Britain. The founders did not want that in America. The part of the First Amendment that forbids any such national denomination is called the Establishment Clause, and it is the part stating, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. Secondly, the First Amendment also prohibited the federal government from interfering with or limiting the people's religious expressions. This part of the First Amendment is called the Free Exercise Clause. It's the part stating or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. So what is the source of Jefferson's now infamous phrase? On November the 7th, 1801, the Baptists of Danbury, Connecticut wrote Jefferson concerned that the guarantee of the free exercise of religion appeared in the First Amendment. To them, this suggested that the right to religious exercise was a government-granted rather than a God-granted right, thus implying that someday the government might try to regulate religious expression. They believed that freedom of religion was a God-granted, unalienable right, and that the government should be powerless to restrict religious activities unless, as the Baptists explained, those activities cause someone to, quote, work ill to his neighbor. Jefferson understood their concern, for he had already proven that it was his concern as well. He replied to the Danbury Baptists on January the 1st, 1802, thanking them for their kind prayers and assuring them that their free exercise of religion was indeed an inalienable right and therefore would not be meddled with by the government. Jefferson pointed out to them that there was, quote, a wall of separation between church and state, and that this wall of separation would prevent the government from interfering with or hindering religious activities.
In modern politics, the term separation of church and state is most commonly used to ban acts of faith in the public arena. But a closer look into history reveals the intentions of this phrase to be just the opposite. How then has our history been redefined and rewritten? Discover our nation's godly history in the American Heritage series. America, this is your heritage.
Modern day now, we believe separation in church and state is to keep the church under control,
right?
You know, and so that the state, you know, and state affairs, you cannot have religious activities into the affairs of state and school and that kind of stuff. So you're talking about a 180
complete
degree
reversal.
Right.
See, what's happened today is separation church and state has become the great club of secularism to beat people of faith back in the corner. Oh, you're trying to pray. Get back in the corner. Separation church. So it's used to stop religious expressions. It was,
that's certainly, Dave, how I understand it.
and that's the way it has been in the last 50 years.
Okay.
What it had been for the first 450 years was to get the government to leave religious expression alone. It's not their business to regulate religious expression. It's not their business to tell you how, when, or where you can pray or what you can say when you do pray. It's not their business to tell you what religious beliefs you're going to have. That was separation church and state. The way that phrase came about was a group of Baptist ministers wrote to Thomas Jefferson, who was president. And Jefferson was a sympathetic ear. I mean, he agreed with them totally. And they said, look, we as Baptists have been the subjects of persecution in America because we were preaching without an Anglican license, and they're not supposed to be doing that. I mean, that's not separate. We want separation church and state. We want the government to leave us alone, stay out of what we do. And so they wrote to Jefferson with that concern. They said, we're really concerned about this First Amendment to the Constitution. I mean, this First Amendment says that Congress can't make any law respecting the establishment of religion. There shouldn't be anything in the Constitution saying what government can or can't do with religion because it's not their domain.
Right.
So their concern is that having government mentioned in the First Amendment, the government someday might think that it had the right to regulate religious expression. You know, we would say, hey, the First Amendment's a protection for us. They were saying, no, the First Amendment opens the door for government to come get involved with religious activities, and the First Amendment's a problem. That was their view. So Jefferson writes them back. He said, look, you don't have to worry. He just assured them the government's not going to stop their religious activities because we have a wall of separation. Now, that's really key because his whole wall of separation is to reassure them that the government's not going to mess with any of their religious activities. You're not going to have to worry about the government stopping religious expression. It's not going to do it. See, that was the design.
Yeah.
Now we use separation church and state to stop religious expression.
In fact, for almost a century and a half after Jefferson's letter, there was no misunderstanding either about the purpose of the First Amendment or the meaning of Jefferson's phrase. Here's an example. In 1853, half a century after Jefferson had written that phrase, a group petitioned Congress urging them to separate Christian principles from government, with chaplains being turned out of Congress and the military, and Christian principles being removed from government and the official public square. They desired a so-called separation of church and state, but in the wrong direction. That is, instead of the government protecting religious expressions in the public arena because of separation, they wanted the government to remove religious expressions. Congress spent a year investigating that possibility and then emphatically rejected it, declaring, had the people, the Founding Fathers, during the Revolution had any suspicion of any attempt to war against Christianity, that revolution would have been strangled in its cradle. At the time of the adoption of the Constitution and its amendments, the universal sentiment was that Christianity should be encouraged, but not any one sect, denomination. The report continued. It said, in this age, there is no substitute for Christianity. That was the religion of the founders of the Republic, and they expected it to remain the religion of their descendants. 2 months later, the Judiciary Committee made this strong declaration. It said, the great, vital, and conservative element in our system, the thing that holds our system together, is the belief of our people in the pure doctrines and the divine truths of the gospel of Jesus Christ. That was Congress. Congress clearly refused to separate Christian principles from the public arena. However, it was not just Congress that refused to do so. The Supreme Court refused to do so as well. In an 1878 case, more than 3/4 of a century after Jefferson had penned his separation letter, the plaintiffs in that case invoked his separation of church and state phrase, hoping to use it to their advantage. However, that Supreme Court was not content to let them get by with just using the 8-word separation phrase out of context from Jefferson's letter, which, by the way, is what courts today do. No, rather than just cite the single phrase, the Supreme Court reprinted a lengthy segment from Jefferson's letter to prove that separation of church and state was intended to protect rather than remove Christian values and practices from public policy.
In one way, you've clarified something and made it very simple. In another way, you have made it a little more complex for me. Let me tell you why. I didn't know that the Bible teaches separation of church and state. I would have said, let's take the phrase separation of church and state and trash it completely. But that's not what you're saying.
No.
We need it, but we just need it applied differently.
We need it applied in a scriptural way.
Okay.
If you take the example of King Uzziah, King Uzziah was a great king of Israel. He feared God, he loved God, he honored God in his administration. His people prospered. He was a great military leader. The Bible tells us that God gave him inventions of war. Well, he had done so well, God had prospered him so much, he decides he's going to go in the temple and offer sacrifices. So he goes in the temple and the priests say, time out. You're not a priest, you're a king. We're the priest, we offer sacrifices, you're not supposed to be in here offering sacrifices. He said, I'm the king, I'm going to act like a priest too. And they said, don't do it. He started to do it. He started to offer the sacrifice and incense, and God struck him with leprosy. He went out of the temple. He eventually died of that leprosy. God weighed in on it. He said, you're the king, you're not the priest. That's a separation of church and state. That's an institutional separation.
Got it.
The king is not the priest. Now, you also have examples of the Bible where, particularly in Genesis, you see that God ordains 3 institutions. He creates first the institution of family, puts man and woman together, said this is good, that's family. Next we have the institution of civil government, where he says, here's how I want you to conduct your horizontal relationships. And he says, all right, whoever sheds man's blood, by him will man's blood be shed. So we start getting civil laws for murder and behavior and theft, etc. And then by the end of Genesis, he says, now here's how I want your vertical relationship conducted. We would call that the church. So those 3 institutions, you got family, you have government, and you have church. As you look across the scriptures, God gives certain directives to one institution that he never gives to the other institutions. Okay. For example, you get to Romans 13, God gives the sword to civil government. He never gives the sword to church. The church is not to bear the sword. If the church picks the sword up, the sword of civil justice, they violated the institutional separations. And that's what happened in that middle time of Christianity, where the church started picking up the sword and saying, you're not believing right, we're going to kill you. Well, that's what happened when church and state merged, was the sword got in the hands of the church, and that's where atrocities come from throughout history. The Inquisition, Crusades, whatever you want to point to, it's when the church took the sword in its hand. So there's very clear institutional differences that God gives in the Bible. And those institutions are supposed to stay right where God put them. They're not supposed to cross into the other. And that's what the Reformers taught. Is, wait a minute, guys, we're not supposed to have these 2 institutions merged. The sword stays over here, the kings are over here, the priests are over here. And that's the way it's supposed to be. And so in America, that's what it was.
In modern politics, the term separation of church and state is most commonly used to ban acts of faith in the public arena. But a closer look into history reveals the intentions of this phrase to be just the opposite. How then has our history been redefined and rewritten? Discover our nation's godly history in the American Heritage series. America, this is your heritage.
In the case Everson versus Board of Education, the court cited only Jefferson's separation metaphor, ignoring the rest of his letter and its clear context. It therefore boldly announced a new policy. The First Amendment has erected a wall between church and state. That wall must be kept high and impregnable. This was a brand new philosophy for the court. No longer would Jefferson's separation phrase protect public religious expressions, as it had for the previous century and a half. It would now become a mandate to exclude religious expressions and to secularize the public square. Significantly, as courts and secularists began to remove public religious expressions, they simultaneously clamored separation of church and state, claiming this is what the founders wanted. This was their great intent. So often have they repeated the separation phrase when talking about the First Amendment that many citizens today now believe that the phrase is actually part of the First Amendment, thus demonstrating the truth of a statement attributed to Dr. William James, the father of modern psychology. There is nothing so absurd, but if you repeat it often enough, people will believe it. The Supreme Court, having announced its new approach in 1947, first nationally implemented the policy of public secularism in 1962 when, for the first time in American history, it ordered the separation of religious principles from education, ruling that it was unconstitutional for a student to pray voluntarily, to say a voluntary prayer at school. The court achieved its reversal of the Constitution's protection for religious expressions first by using the phrase separation of church and state without regard to its historical meaning, and then by redefining the meaning of a single word within the separation phrase, the word church. For nearly 2 centuries prior to that case, the word church in the phrase separation of church and state was defined to mean a federally established national denomination, such as was represented by the Baptists or Catholics or Anglicans or Presbyterians or whatever. However, in 1962, the court decided that the word church would no longer mean a religious institution, it would now mean a religious activity. So instead of the First Amendment being used to prevent the federal government from setting up a national denomination, which voluntary prayer certainly did not do, it now meant that the federal government must not allow a public religious activity, which voluntary prayer certainly was.
Jefferson very wisely attached separation of church and state to what we call the Free Exercise Clause.
Wow.
Now, the First Amendment of the Constitution doesn't have anything to say about separation of church and state. As a matter of fact, here's a really fun thing that we don't hear much about. We're told today that this is one of the great intents of the Founding Fathers, is separation of church and state. Well, first off, Thomas Jefferson was not a framer of the First Amendment. He was not even in America when the First Amendment was framed. He was overseas in Europe. He had no part in framing it. As a matter of fact, a biography that was written by Joseph Priestley about Thomas Jefferson tried to link Jefferson to the First Amendment of the Constitution. And Jefferson wrote back his friend and said, no, 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 you got to take me out of that section. I had nothing to do with the Constitution. I had nothing to do with the Bill of Rights. I was not in America when it was done. I was not a participant. I had one letter sent to me about what was going to be in it, and that's all. I never even saw it till I got back to America. So we've made a guy who had no role in the First Amendment to be the chief spokesman on it. Now, what we've got is we have 90 Founding Fathers who did frame the First Amendment. All of their debates, from start to finish, are in the records of Congress from June the 19th or 20th of 1789 to about September the 24th and 25th of 1789. So you have these guys for several months, 90 guys going after the language of the First Amendment. Here's what we'll permit, here's what we won't permit. All the records of Congress are there. Not one single one of those 90 Founding Fathers ever even mentioned the phrase separation of church and state when they're framing the First Amendment. They didn't even talk about it. Now, it seemed like if that was their intent for the First Amendment, somebody would have said something about it.
Right.
Phrase is not mentioned one time. It's mentioned in a letter that comes later by Thomas Jefferson.
That had nothing to do with the framing of it.
All that letter had to do was to reassure them the government's not going to interfere with their religious expression. And so he uses a metaphor that is well known to those people. Baptists have had it, Christians have had it. Any Reformation-minded person understands separation of church and state means keep the institutions apart. Don't let the government stop our religious expressions, keep it apart. And now we've turned it completely on its head. You see, what's happened today is if we really believed separation of church and state, then we wouldn't allow the state to have zoning or building codes that affect the church. We wouldn't allow the state to have any kind of influence over health codes in the church or employment codes of the church or tax codes of the church. We'd say separation church and state, state, you can't touch the church at all if we really believe separation church and state. But what's happened is separation church and state means, oh, you religious people can't get involved in the public arena. Reversal from what it's supposed to be.
The Constitution mandates in Article 1, Section 5, Paragraph 3, that written records be kept of what goes on in Congress. The founders required this because they wanted government open, accessible, and accountable to the people. Within the congressional records, you or I at any time can read what our elected officials are doing and saying, or not doing and not saying, and then hold them accountable. Every debate and every vote which has taken place in Congress from 1774 to the present is recorded in these public records. And it is because of these records that we know exactly what happened when Congress moved into this building. According to the records for late November of 1800, Congress spent the first few weeks organizing the rooms, the committees, their locations, etc. And then in the first week of December 1800, Congress made an interesting decision. What was that decision? Congress decided that the Capitol building would also serve as a church building. The U.S. Capitol, this building, became a church. The use of this building as a church building is confirmed not only by the records of Congress, but also by the diaries of those who served in Congress at the time. For example, when John Quincy Adams was a U.S. Senator in 1803, he recorded in his diary for October the 30th, attended public service at the Capitol, where Mr. Rattoon, an Episcopalian clergyman from Baltimore, preached a sermon. The week before, he had written, religious service is usually performed on Sundays at the Treasury office and at the Capitol. I went both forenoon and afternoon to the Treasury. Very few realize that this building, as well as other government buildings, served as church buildings, but indeed such was the case.
In modern politics, the term separation of church and state is most commonly used to ban acts of faith in the public arena. But a closer look into history reveals the intentions of this phrase to be just the opposite. How then has our history been redefined and rewritten? Discover our nation's godly history in the American Heritage series. America, this is your heritage.
Dave, what I think you have just done is given me information about what I thought I knew about the term separation of church and state and spun the term separation of church and state literally 180 degrees from the original intent of its framers.
Or it was state, you stay out of our affairs. Yeah. Get out of our face.
Let me show you how corrupt the interpretation has become. Because the First Amendment to the Constitution is very simple. It says Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Now, if we don't understand that, we go to the records of Congress. That means Congress cannot establish a federal denomination. They can't make us all Baptists, Presbyterians, or anything else. And Congress can't do anything to impede religious expression. That was their goal. You stay out of regulating people's religious expressions, and you don't set up a federal church. Now, that's what it meant. And so from the time that the First Amendment was ratified in 1791, all the way until 1947, that's what the First Amendment meant. But in 1947, the U.S. Supreme Court said, we need to change this a little bit. They said Jefferson used separation of church and state to protect the free exercise of religion. We think he applied it to the wrong clause. Instead of keeping the government out, we need to apply separation of church and state to government expressions. And so what we need to do now is stop religious activities in public. So they came up with what's called the establishment test in 1947. Then we get to a number of cases coming to the court that deal with religious expression. And in those cases at the court said, you know, we've got so many cases, we better erect a new standard so you understand what's constitutional religion. And the case 1971 called Lemon versus Kurtzman, they came out with a three-pronged test. It's called the Lemon test because it came out of the case Lemon versus Kurtzman. It says if you want a religious activity to be constitutional, here's what you have to do. They said the only way that a public religious expression is going to be constitutional is if the primary purpose of that public religious expression is secular. Wait a minute. That's completely oxymoronic.
Right.
There's no way you can prove that the primary purpose of prayer is secular. There's no way you can prove the primary purpose of the display of the nativity scene is secular. There's no way you can prove that the primary purpose of saying under God in the pledge is secular. You can't do it. And so now we lose every case on religious expression because of the lemon test, which says unless religion has a secular primary purpose, you can't do it. Well, that was 1971. So then we move along to 1985, and in the case of 1985, the court came up with a new test for the First Amendment. It's called the endorsement test. And they said, you know, if it looks like the government is even friendly to religion, that's unconstitutional. And so now they have to appear to be hostile. So anytime religion pops up, they go, oh no, we can't do that. And that's why you can't have a student individually say something religious at a graduation.
Wow.
That's why you can't have a city councilman say something religious to open a city council, because that might look like government's being friendly to religion. That's the endorsement test. And the final and the most absurd test was given in 1992, and the Supreme Court calls it the outsider test. And the outsider test says, you know, if you're part of a religious minority, like if you're an atheist, only 6% of America doesn't believe in God, so if you're in that religious minority and you see somebody else doing a religious activity in the majority that makes you feel like an outsider, we'll make them all stop so that you won't feel like an outsider. So as you look across the cases, we had several dozen cases on the Ten Commandments in America, Ten Commandments displays. The people who sued in those cases, you'll find the same phrase in every one of them. They said, you know, I was walking down the sidewalk and I looked over at the Capitol and I saw that monument of the Ten Commandments, and when I saw that, I felt like an outsider in my own nation. And so the court stepped in and say, all right, take out the Ten Commandments. You can't feel it. Well, how about the 94% who don't feel like outsiders?
Right.
And by the way, if the 94% say, I feel like an outsider when it's gone, they say, oh, you're in the majority, you don't count. This only works if you're in a religious minority. So now separation church and state means that it has to be secular, government can't appear to be friendly toward religion, and if religious expression of somebody individually makes you feel uncomfortable, we'll make them all stop. That's completely reversed from the original separation that meant government, don't stop a religious expression. It's not your business to tell us what religious expressions are supposed to occur. What a reversal of separation church and state just in the last 50 years.
For more information on the American Heritage Series, or to find books and other resources, visit wallbuilders.com. Through the American Heritage Series, renowned historian David Barton communicates our nation's forgotten, godly foundations and encourages us to once again view history through a truthful lens. For only when we recognize and embrace God's hand in our history can America become all that it was intended to be. Through Wall Builders, historian David Barton seeks to rebuild the walls of America's unique religious, moral, and constitutional heritage by educating the public and encouraging people of faith to become active in strengthening America's great foundations. For more information on how you can become involved,